Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I'm speaking with Ioan Grillo, and Ioan is an author. His books include El Narco, Gangster Warlords, and Blood, Gun, Money, How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. And he's also a journalist. You can find his stuff in places like the New York Times and Time and Esquire. Hi Ioan, thanks for coming on.
Great to be here. How you doing?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Um, so I gotta ask, because like I said, I've been following you a bit on Twitter. I think I mentioned that when I reached out to you, and then I've been seeing what you're writing about Mexico and stuff. But how did you get into writing about Mexico and Latin America? I mean, you know, we'd be talking earlier, and you're in the UK, and you're from the UK. So, like, how did you get into that?
Yeah, sure. So in the year 2000, I wanted to get into journalism.
Mhm.
And back in those days, one of the ways to get into foreign international journalism was to work at English language newspapers, which were around the world a lot back in those days, and you could make a living as a journalist doing that, and then get into writing for bigger international publications. And I'd already lived in Spain for a year and spoke some Spanish, so I went to Mexico and I got a job I arrived in Mexico in the year 2000. In the year 2001, got a job in the English language newspaper called The News. And I started right away. I hadn't planned to, but right away started covering a lot of these big drug cartel stories, corruption stories, and that kind of thing. And then after a couple of years there, I started working for international publications, began with like the Houston Chronicle, worked for the Associated Press before going on to later to the New York Times, Time Magazine and stuff. And as I did this, and I was covering the drug cartel issue, and it was really rising up. It was a real escalation of the violence in Mexico associated with this. So when I've been there for some 8 years and was covering this, it became a real big international issue. You had film crews coming from around the world. Some of the film crews actually, because you had a slight lapse in the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you had the crews, TV crews who'd been in Iraq and Afghanistan, kind of rotating around to Mexico. And I was already been there 8 years, so started working with a lot of these crews and working on documentary films and series and that kind of things as well. And after a while, I realized I can't just tell this story in short stories and news pieces. Or I need to write a book about this. So I published my first book in 2011, and that became a trilogy with my third book published this year.
Hey, great. Now, like when you got there in 2000, because I'm going to go by like memory, so it's probably very faulty. Um, but initially, like when you like, or, okay, when I at least think of cartels, initially, that comes to mind of Colombia,
Mm.
and then, but then, I remember seeing a few things, and it could be on PBS or BBC, I'm not sure, about how when it moved into Mexico, because instead of just being a conduit for cocaine, you can produce it there and grow it there, and then just ship it up from there. So had that already started in Mexico when you got there in 2000, or was that still coming in from Colombia, or how is that?
Yeah, sure. So, the history of Mexican drug trafficking, you can trace it back at least 100 years.
Mhm.
In the year 1914, it's when the United States passed the Harrison's Narcotics Tax Act, and it started restricting cocaine and opium. So in that, from then on, from 1915, you had initially it was Chinese Mexicans smuggling opium to Chinese Americans. In some of these very early cases, you can look at one case that the American custom agents looked at back in 1916 of this. And even back then, you had a corrupt governor involved. So there's political corruption. And so you've got this history of a century of drug trafficking from Mexico. And it really boomed in the 1960s when American drug appetite started to really increase. I think if you look at the kind of modern drug consumption we live in, you really got to look at the 60s when drug consumption in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, in Canada, a lot of these countries started to really increase. One of the reasons I personally felt connected a lot in the issue of drugs, I grew up just outside of Brighton in southeast England, in a place with a lot of drug use. So I grew up around a lot of drug users. In the 1980s, I knew 4 teenagers or young men who died of heroin overdoses. the current opioid epidemic in the United States. I kind of lived a bit that growing up in the UK in the 1980s. So I grew up around this drug thing. But anyway, so you had the big drug consumption in the 1960s, cocaine use growing in the 1970s, and then, like you say, you had originally cocaine being flown directly from Colombia to the United States. People just take planes, fly right over, fly away from Colombia, go right over the Caribbean into Florida. So that was a big route. And then in the 1980s, under Reagan, you had that route being cut off or being reduced. And so you had the Navy, you had this Miami task force going down there, and a lot of Navy DAs busting that. So the Colombian smugglers just said, well, we're going to bounce it through Mexico. The route had already, in fact, opened up from the 1970s of bouncing cocaine through Mexico. We call it sometimes the Mexican trampoline, to bounce the cocaine from Colombia to the United States. So you can just move the cocaine there into Mexico. You've got a 2,000-mile border, and then get cocaine over there. So by the end of the 90s, when I was arriving, it had become the vast majority. I mean, people talk about 85% or so of cocaine believed to be bouncing through Mexico at that point. So the cartels had become very wealthy by the time I arrived in Mexico. I also arrived in Mexico in the moment, in fact, I arrived in Mexico the day before President Vicente Fox took power, ending 71 years of one-party rule. He had one party running the whole country for 71 years, at times running everything. I mean, literally every mayor, every police chief, every governor. Times they gradually had opposition kind of coming in. And that ended. Now, this is part of what unleashed the violence. And one point of comparison is the Soviet Union, when you had, that was 74 years, I guess from 1917 to 1991, kind of 74 years, 74 years of one party in control, and then it kind of breaks up, and then you have a lot of unleashing of gangsters and violence when you have a political system breaking down. That's one of the reasons that the violence was unleashed in the 2000s, alongside this gradual enrichment of the cartels with cocaine money. And then when I was in Mexico, they also moved very heavily into crystal meth money, and then more recently into fentanyl money and heroin money. Well, heroin's been around, but like into big, taking advantage of the epidemic of opioids and heroin that has come about the last few years.
Like your latest book, and I mean, I guess you can go back to Iran Contra if you want, as far as arming, drug cartels and stuff. But but like how, when you say they're arming the guns, the gangs and the cartels, is it because of gun smuggling? I mean, or is it something like Iran Contra where they're actually getting like arms for drugs type of thing?
Yes. So the main thing is the fact you've got firearms trafficking. So you've got firearms trafficking from the legal US market to the Mexican cartels. However, there are elements of the government being complicit or in these things. Now, Iran Contra you mentioned, and that's connected to this story. So you had a lot of those weapons given by the US government to Central American countries in the 1980s in these fights, which are now being used by cartels in this fighting. So one example is the grenades. You had more than 67,000, so I remember now, I think there's hundreds of thousands of fragmentation grenades, M67 fragmentation grenades, given to the Salvadoran forces in the that civil war. Now, afterwards, there were a lot of left in these big stockpiles, and these hand grenades are being stolen from those stockpiles and ending up being used by the drug cartels. So you have these gun battles, like one that happened in the city of Matamoros on the border with Texas, where more than 300 frag grenades were thrown in one battle. As an example as well of those grenades being in the black market, they were kind of crazy story. There's a couple of them being smuggled into prisons. A woman went to visit her boyfriend in prison, and she was found with a fragmentation grenade hidden inside her, in between her legs. And he was smuggling it into prison to give the prison so he could try and blow his way out. In fact, this story just happened a couple of days ago. There was a grenade thrown in a Honduran prison where some MS-13 inmates were playing football, and there's some Barrio 18, Barrio 18 inmates threw a grenade into that football game, and it blew up while they're playing. I went into a Honduran prison and seen them openly carrying guns in there. I mean, it's gone crazy in there. So on one side you had that, then you have other stories, for example, of the government complicity. There's various scandals that have been in the last few years. The most well-known is called Fast and Furious. So Fast and Furious, a lot of people might have heard about that already, named after the car racing movies. And Fast and Furious was a scheme, an operation by the ATF, by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives in the United States, to build up a conspiracy case against gun traffickers by following the guns going to the cartels. And they watched more than 2,000, well, almost 2,000 firearms directly in the Fast and Furious operation. There was another related operation called Wide Receiver with about now close to 500 guns. And they were sitting there watching these guns be trafficked to the cartels. Now, the way this played out was you had these, what are known as straw buyers. So somebody who's paid money to go and buy a gun. They were paying them $50 for pistols, $100 for rifles, $500 for Barrett 50s. One of these guys spent $500,000 going to shops in Phoenix buying these guns for cartels. And they just sat there watching him do it, watching him buy the guns, watching them take them to the cartels, watching them go down south of the border. And these were used in pretty brutal massacres. So this is kind of a pretty big scandal. That was actually under the Obama administration. That was under Eric Holder as the Attorney General. So that was a big thing happening there. But also you have got, and I've done a lot of interviews with firearms traffickers. You've got really, in many ways, the cartels being just going in and buying the guns very, very easily. And American politics not basic law enforcement happening really with this. So, for example, I mean, there's cases of people buying 85 guns in single sales for gangs. There's multiple cases of people going in buying 10 AK-47s, the same model, and they're for the cartels. Of a supposed housewife going and buying a Barrett 50 for more than $10,000 in cash, and then going nice and buying another one. So the way they're doing is trafficking. And when I went into this book, which is a very thorny issue in the United States, obviously the Second Amendment's huge, gun stuff's huge, but it's not, I'm not attacking people's right to bear arms or the the Second Amendment, saying this is what's happening in terms of firearms trafficking. And you've got this enormous amount of firearms going to these cartels, who are then carrying out huge amounts of violence in Mexico, where you've had more than 300,000 murders since 2007. Become one of the parts of it, the most violent cities in the world. You've got refugees fleeing that violence and then trying to apply for asylum in the United States. You've created kind of a chain of destabilization happening in the region because of the effects of this. So you see a lot of connections with these issues.
Now, we'd been talking about this earlier. Like, I've worked overseas. Now, a couple of things I saw when I was. Now, this story might be apocryphal. I don't know, but apparently in Afghanistan, they'd done a buyback guns type of thing from the locals. So NATO was doing that. So people were coming in and bringing in, like, some of these guys were fighting with like old, 1900s Enfields.
Yes.
Right? So they would come in with Enfields and they'd get cash, right? Okay, this is your money. Now, some of these people went back and took that money they were given because it was more than the gun was worth or whatever, and they could buy themselves an AK, or they could buy themselves, and so like that backfired. And another thing, this was in Bosnia, But when it was Yugoslavia, apparently Tito had given every individual 6 anti-personnel mines and 1 anti-tank mine. So if the country got overrun, defend yourself. And Bosnia is still, as far as I know, one of the more heavily concentrated mined areas in the world. Like I remember seeing a map from where I was first stationed to Sarajevo, and the whole highway was like one big red line of line mines. I mean, and they told you straight out, if you stop and you have to pee, don't go out, like stay on the road. Do not go on the side of the road. Like stay on like the asphalt if you're going to pee. Like they just said the whole highway was mined.
Yeah, so I went to Eastern Europe as part of the investigation for this book, and I went to the Zastava factory in Serbia and the factory, AK-47 factory in Kujir, Romania as well. I did a trace or followed a trace of a gun from a murder scene in Mexico, in which an American agent of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Jaime Zapata, was murdered, and followed the whole route of those weapons to the factory in the Kujir, Romania. 2 guns, in fact, from that factory used by a mob of a cartel called the Zetas. One known as a Draco, which is a kind of known as the smallest type of AK in the world, and one of them, the Waza-10, is like longer one. So you had so in terms of the guns, I mean, in terms of the broader issue of guns, and I did look as well. I mean, how firearms were also. It's interesting when you look at the kind of stories of these and how guns also leak to the Islamic State, or the Taliban and so forth. And you have these factories in the kind of these long flows. And one of the things, I mean, I don't pretend there's easy answers to these issues. I do think in Western Europe, following the terror attacks, a lot, particularly in France in 2015, there was a lot of gun terror attacks. And if you look at the Bataclan disco attack, which is the worst mass shooting in Western Europe since World War II, then that firearm actually came from the Zastava factory. Some of the guns there were taken from the Zastava factory. They'd been in a militia, in a Serbian militia, dissipated into the black market and moved around. But following a lot of those shootings in 2015, there was a big effort in Western Europe to try and crack down on black market firearms, try and crack down on firearms in the criminal markets that terrorists can use. And you see that as well, these kind of links between, and one of the things I've been looking a lot at in the last few years is this blurring between crime and war and terror. I think we see a lot of that in the new century to understand a lot of the violence that's going on. So it was an attempt to crack down. I think it was successful in many ways, and we do see some of the more recent terror attacks in Western Europe have been with knives and cars and that kind of thing. And they are less casualties in those cases. I mean, when you have a guy with a knife in a terror attack, and you can see even cases like in London where a guy who was a Millwall supporters, a middle-aged Millwall football hooligan, came at this guy with a knife and, took being stabbed and survived. And, it's very difficult to do that when somebody's spraying with a gun. There's a difference with these things. Now, in the Americas, it's very, very different than Europe. I mean, if you look at, obviously, the United States has, by the last estimate, 393 million guns in American in civilian hands. It's more than the next 25 countries combined. So the number of firearms in the United States is way beyond anything in Europe. In Mexico, there's a huge amount of guns around in Mexico in criminal hands. You go down El Salvador, Honduras. But then, there's still got to be ways to reduce this. And one of the things I've been looking at, is the level of violence in cities. I've been covering violence the last 20 years. And so, I also went into Baltimore, Maryland, as part of this latest book, and looked at the violence there, the gun violence in Baltimore, Maryland. I spoke to gun traffickers there, drug dealers there. One guy I also spoke to was a guy called Dante Barksdale, who was actually one of the figures that the series The Wire was based on. In the series is called D'Angelo Barksdale. And I spoke to him. He was then later This year, he was shot dead. In fact, in Baltimore. And so he's going to see how the gun violence plays out, and how you have, the 50 most murderous cities in the world. You've got, in the recent years, about 47 of them have been in the Americas. Canada's the safe place in the Americas, obviously. It was interesting, the United States often has about 4 of these cities, and often the same ones coming up. I mean, it's Baltimore, we can feature in there. It's St. Louis, it's New Orleans. These are the ones. And then right across Latin America and Mexico will often have a very large number of these, the cities that I've been covering in Mexico. And then you'll see them right across in various places, Brazil and so forth, Honduras, El Salvador, these kind of places. So trying to understand how these places are so violent, what it's like, how that plays out. And it's pretty horrific how people live with that level of violence, across Latin America. And what this means in terms of just really heavy strains and trauma you get on people living this kind of violence, and how people can get out of this.
Just like one thing, like when you're talking about the violence and all that. So I did a student exchange in '92, or whatever, student exchange. Like, I went and studied at the University of Sao Paulo, and then there was and then there was a bunch of students from Brazil that came up to Montreal the following semester, and it was just that's why I said exchange. But I made friends with the pot dealer or one of the pot dealers on campus. Yeah. And one day he's like, "Hey, come with me. I'm going to go get some." So I jump on the back of his bike and we go to a favela. And then he's getting his knapsack or whatever, and he pulls out a gun. And I'm like, look at him, like, what are you doing? He's like, what? He just assumed I had one. I'm like, look, I came here on a plane. Like, where do you expect me to get one from? And he's like, oh, I don't know. He goes, oh, you need one here. I was like, great. Like, where are you taking me? Okay, there's a lot of gun violence in the States. And I mean, like, you talk like places you had mentioned, like Baltimore, you could talk about places like Chicago and stuff like that. But is that expected? Like in Mexico City, is that, kind of like, okay, there's a 50-50 chance I'm going to see some gun violence on the street? Like, or like, how does like what's the mentality of that? Like, they're like ordinary everyday people.
Yeah, sure. Let me just quickly answer you, follow up on the Brazil anecdote, and then answer your question. So yeah, I mean, for my second book, Gangster Warlords, I have a big section on Brazil, looking at some of the big crime organizations in Brazil, including one called the Red Commando. And I mean, I went into one of the favelas in Brazil. Went to several favelas there. One of the favelas I went into, a favela called Antares on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, where they were, just like guys riding around on motorcycles with guns and grenade launchers and blatantly selling drugs off the table. And we went to what they call a funk party, favela funk, and we actually went there. We stayed all night in this favela with these big booming speakers, and then one that they were dancing around with holding their guns up and doing this dance around the place. And one of the fascinating stories about the Red Commando is that they were formed in the 1970s. And originally they were formed when the government locked up these bank robbers with these political prisoners. And they did it deliberately, saying, well, the political prisoners who were these kind of left-wing communist political prisoners. And it said, well, the bank robbers are going to beat the crap out of these middle class, rebels, and probably beat them up and rape them and stuff. And that'd be funny. But actually the opposite happened. The bank robbers started organizing, and they came together and became like a politicized bank robbers. and then they went out and started going to drug trafficking. The Red Commando. So they're kind of this weird crime family, these kind of weird political origins. They kind of see themselves kind of defending. So the police, and one of the police I interviewed there from a hardcore hit squad who would go into the favelas. And I asked him if he'd been under gunfight much, and he said, "Look, no, I'm in gunfights every week. I go in there, we're in gunfights." I said, "Have you been shot?" And he goes, "I've been shot in the back of the neck. I've still got a bullet embedded in the back of my neck." And crazy stories he had, and this kind of weird low intensity war that plays out there. But the way that, say, the violence, the way this reflects, and the reality of this, to kind of explain it to people, is this is a weird thing of you have normality and normal living around the violence. So it's not like you go into Mexico and everywhere there's violence all the time, and everywhere you look, everyone's got guns all the time. First, it varies massively across the country. You go to the tourist resorts, you're fine. The big tourist resorts like Cancun, well, in the tourist resort, you're fine. There is violence in Cancun itself. There have suddenly been shootings in clubs and so forth. They're not totally fine. But a lot of the time you can go to a tourist resort and you can be okay and not see anything. You can be in Mexico City is not the most violent part of Mexico. And Mexico City is, it's a big city of 20 million people, the whole urban area. And it's got a level of violence, but it doesn't compare to the worst. And it can, but you've got parts of Mexico which are really, really crazy. Okay. So some of the parts of Mexico and crazy stuff happening. Now, even in those really violent parts, you can go there and it can look normal. You think, oh, well, this looks pretty normal to me. And then suddenly there could be a crazy gunfight happening and like crazy stuff. I mean, you've had things like the Culicanazo, the city of Culiacan, where the military and the police captured the son of Chapo Guzman. He has 700 to 800 gunmen on the streets fighting 250 soldiers. Well, that was kind of nuts. You have, this violence I've been covering where you just, we drove along one day and there'd been a guy shot in, a police commander shot dead having breakfast in a restaurant. We literally drove into his body was lying out on the ground. We're filming that, and then they cleared it up, and the restaurant actually set up and served lunch, so people could arrive there. So what I mean is people living around normal life around violence. People could arrive at a restaurant, are having lunch. They didn't know the guy had been murdered there in the morning. So you have that now. You also have people living normal lives, and then suddenly tragedy might strike a family. I'm not only talking about you have sometimes people who I've done a lot of interviews with the murderers themselves. I've interviewed a lot of cartel killers, gang members, cartel traffickers, and these kind of people. And so you get really into their lives and where they're living, and they're living really in the thick of this, and they're killing people themselves, carrying out murder, and they're having extreme life. But also you have regular people, and you have middle class people who suddenly have tragedy that's been struck. A story, many tragic stories. One of them, for example, there's a tragic story from a mother I interviewed in Monterrey, who was looking for her son, who had been taken by gunmen from her house. And she was a school teacher, and he was an 18-year-old philosophy student, just begun at university, his first year of university. She had a 15-year-old son, and an armed group came to the house and just robbed the house and just took him. Never found him, disappeared case. Don't know why exactly. Did they take him as forced recruitment, which they can do sometimes, just to kind of try and get a ransom and then get some money and then kill him anyway. So a lot of time when you have, what you have is really with the drug cartels is, and in Mexico, you've got very, very heavy paramilitary organized crime. They're like become paramilitary style groups, also sophisticated organized crime, also people who have a political influence and a kind of cultural influence, have this narco culture around them as well. And you have that then with this kind of presence there and how that affects society. So it's a kind of weird thing, but it does create a dark note for everybody in society, and it's certainly one of the reasons that people want to leave a lot of these countries when that level of violence is around.
Just on that, I mentioned I was in Afghanistan, so overall I was about 7 years in Afghanistan. Now, even if I was on when you're talking about the normalcy, if you had ISAF headquarters in Kabul, there was this nice walled off little garden. You could have cappuccinos and espressos, and you could sit down and relax. And I mean, it just, if you didn't hear the noise from the outside, you wouldn't realize where you were. It was a great place.
Yeah.
But, I could have been on a base because I was a civilian contractor, so we did rotation. So I'd work about 2 months and have a couple of weeks off, that type of thing, right? So I could have been on base for my whole rotation and not have actually left any base. But it wasn't until you actually, I'd left Kabul and we would land in Dubai, or let's say wait until land in Europe somewhere, and you can actually feel stress leaving you because you don't realize until you get out of there, like, okay, it's always in the back of your mind that, okay, yeah, the base could get rocketed. I could have to, go out tomorrow, and I've been in vehicles that took small arms fire and things like that. Like, so I mean, there's things like that that's always in the back of your mind, and you don't realize until you leave. So, is there like a buildup of stress, kind of like that, just in your average everyday life? Because if it's, and I guess it depends on where you are. Like you mentioned, I'm just assuming Juarez is worse than Mexico City, but that could just be
Sure,
a
yeah.
little bit like so. Is there a buildup of stress like that, or is that just
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So like say with Mexico City, it's a violent city, it's a rough city, but that's more comparable to living in a rough city in the United States. Where you got a certain stress because of crime and violence and stuff, but it's not totally off the chart for most people. And then you have some of the places. I mean, let's look, like somewhere like Reynosa, Matamoros. You've got right now. There's been some crazy firefights there. So there you got you have got trauma, and I think people, you hear gunfights. I mean, you've got some crazy stuff happening, and some of it's not even being reported because some of the cartels will. And when I talk about cartels as well, we talk about these organizations that are also effectively controlling local police in some cases, and you've got extremely corrupt security forces in Mexico. So you've got a complicated interplay of security forces and cartels, coming out. But in some cases where a local police force will be completely under control of a cartel. And so you have some crazy stuff happening. Some of the repressed reporting of it, where you have like long, prolonged gunfights happening right on the US border, running 3.5 hours, 4 hours, sustained gunfights happening. Bunch of bodies being, and then they clean up the bodies and repress the body count because some of the cartels don't want heat coming to their city. They're controlling the city. They don't want more military and more Marines coming in because that will mess up with their operations. They want to pretend things are quiet and things are okay there. So you have these things happening, and yeah, sure, prolonged stress and people leaving, especially people. And it can be like local journalists. I mean, there's been more than 150 journalists who've been murdered. There was another murder yesterday. There was a further murder of a journalist, a third journalist murdered this month in Mexico. People who covering and just under stress, and just people as well. There's been cases of school kids and kids hiding on the table where gunfire's been happening. It's a very, if you look at I would say understanding Mexican violence is a weird hybrid armed conflict. There's a debate around this, but you have levels of violence and deaths comparable to armed conflicts. Armed groups comparable to armed conflicts. Use of the military and Marines comparable to armed conflicts. But without clear theaters. I went to one time see the Islamic State uprising in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So I went there in Marawi and saw there, and you had a clear, they called it the MBA, the main battle area. And that area was constant fighting, constant bang, 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 bang there. And then outside of that, there wasn't fighting. There was a cleared area, a whole buffer area, the whole city being cleared out. But then you go further out, and you're outside the battle area. Whereas in Mexico, you've got kind of fighting cropping up in all kinds of places, and not any clear delineation of where that battle area is fighting. And a lot of murders are happening by assassinations, by people being kidnapped off the street and then murdered and their bodies dumped and bodies being hung from bridges and mass graves. The biggest mass grave had the remains of 298 people in it, and that was in a bunch of fields next to a housing area. When they were uncovering it, there was a stench of bodies that were going into this housing area. So a very weird mix of violence and extreme violence, comparable to a war, but not recognized as a war, and not making sense quite like a regular war. It's definitely some kind of weird hybrid 21st century conflict that's playing out.
With the cartels now, let's say tomorrow the United States said, you know what, we're going to decriminalize everything.
Yeah.
All drugs are legal. Like, you know, are they so big and so got their fingers in so many different things? Like, I mean, I'm assuming that would make a dent in their money, but like, are they just like too big to fail type of thing? Like they could just stick around as cartels, just working with like guns, or would that actually hurt them quite a bit?
Yeah. If so, first when we talk about the drug policy area, in the drug policy language, you have decriminalized and you have legalized being two different concepts that are related. Yeah. So decriminalize is when you say, you know, and it's more, decriminalize is more of a strategy for users. So you like, if you catch somebody with say a couple of grams of cocaine, a stash of heroin for their personal use, rather than saying we're going to prosecute you and send you to prison on criminal charges for that drug possession, it's going to be like, not a criminal fine. It could be a civil fine, or it could just be a slap on the wrist, or send you to rehab or whatever. So that, they did that in Portugal, I would say fairly successfully. In the United States, they started trying this now in Oregon, and there's certain moves in the United States. We'll see. It's difficult. There's some issues around that in the US with the amount of kind of homeless people and drug thing. But I think I don't think people should be sent to prison for being drug addicts. I don't think they should be locked up for that. But then legalize is different, because also you have the cartels, as there was like moving drugs by the tons, and decriminalize doesn't extend to that. You still normally would bust somebody if they've got a ton of heroin or a ton of cocaine. A ton of heroin's a lot, just in smaller quantities, but a ton of cocaine, or a whole, huge amounts of heroin or whatever. But if we were to talk about drug legalization itself, and it's hypothetical, it's very difficult to see how you do this exactly. But if really the entire black market of drugs, which the UN estimates is worth over $300 billion a year globally, the US records over $150 billion in the United States, then sure, that would take huge amounts of money out of cartels, and they're into a bunch of other businesses. They're into people smuggling, meaning that the undocumented migrants who go to the United States, people who are trying to sneak into the United States, are paying cartels. They're paying polleros or coyotes, who are the ones who smuggle them, take them over, and they're paying them, who then paying the cartels. They're into theft of oil. They're into product piracy. They're into sex trafficking. They're into wildcat mining. They're into extortion, kidnapping. So a whole bunch of crimes. But still, if the drugs were removed, that would radically change the nature of organized crime, and that would take away huge resources for these organizations. The question really, though, is it's not, when you get down into the nitty gritty of drug policy, it's not a simple button that can be pressed. It's actually quite difficult how we move on. I mean, I believe in drug policy reform, meaning I believe that the conceptual war on drugs has failed. Richard Nixon declared that just been 50-year anniversary. In that time, and he talked about in very extremist kind of abolitionist terms, we're going to abolish heroin from the lives of Americans. There will be no heroin. After 50 years, we've got record deaths of overdose deaths in the United States, and we've got huge amounts of violence in Latin America, and also violence linked to drug selling in American cities. But then, how do we actually move away from this? Really what the thing. So legalizing marijuana, that's happened. But then how do we move beyond legalizing marijuana? I mean, we still need to move some way in legalizing marijuana. There's still some way to go with that to really get that happen, through in Mexico and so forth. But then how do we move really? What do we do about heroin, cocaine, crystal meth? The answer is I don't know. we need to have that conversation and beginning, like, how do we reduce, addiction? How do we try and actually get this stuff, get this money away?
Okay. Just because, I mean, like, that's just my thing. Like, if you take a look at the mafia as well, that originally started because of prohibition, pretty much. And then they were in everything. So, like, it's once prohibition went away, it's not like the mafia went away. So just wondering, like, what would happen with these guys?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a bunch of hardened criminals out there. They're not going to suddenly, like, all become honest people and do these, and they could do other crimes as well. What I do think is, if you look at the cartels in Mexico, and this is a huge industry with so many of these people working in this, they've been pumped with drug money for decades and decades, and they're still getting it now. Now, what they do, you could say, well, if they don't traffic drugs, they'll just turn to more violent, predatory crimes like kidnapping. But actually, you've seen there's areas where they'll do both. They'll do whatever they can get away with. So, and they'll get money. So they'll be making, on one side, loads and loads of money from drugs. And then that money they've got, which can then buy loads of guns and can pay off police officers, and pay to train sicarios and pay the salaries of sicarios who are the gunmen. And then they've got all that power and guns and killers, and then they go on and do a bunch of kidnapping and extortion, because so it's kind of big, they do both. Now, kidnapping has gone down a little bit in Mexico the last 5 years or so, because there's been an effort at least to create on a state level some more hardcore anti-kidnapping squads, and that makes them kick back a bit on the kidnapping, which is a good thing, because kidnapping is a really brutal antisocial crime. But they still get away with a whole bunch of stuff. Now, if drugs are out of the equation, and from a law enforcement point of view, you're dealing with things like extortion. I mean, these are solvable crimes. I mean, extortion doesn't happen in a big way in say Canada or the United States, because you also have to try and create decent police forces in Mexico and Latin America. But you've got an easier thing of solving extortion, because then if they're shopkeepers going to say, I don't want to pay extortion, if I can go to a decent police force, go to them, and they can go and stop these guys. And it's kind of, they have to expose themselves to collect extortion money. So you've got a better chance, and these organizations will not have the gel putting them together. Now, I mean, don't get me wrong, Mexico still has an enormous law enforcement problem, and drug policy reform is not the only way out of this. But I do think, in terms of the violence in Latin America, in terms of the kind of failure on war on drugs, we have to try and figure out a better way forward. We've been stumbling through with a kind of a policy of drugs that's not working for many years. Now, again, I understand these things are not easy, but I do believe on the drug policy issue, this is one of the issues that we could try and move forward on as societies politically. I don't think this is an issue which we're divided on that badly ideologically anymore. I think, if you look at, for example, marijuana legalization, there was big support for it even in like Mississippi. They legalized medical marijuana. You find conservatives, you find libertarians, you find people who are on the left, who can all traditionally has been on the left, or all kinds of people who can come together on this issue. So it's something we think we probably can make progress on, whereas we might not be able to on some other issues.
Look, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I just got a couple of last questions for you. The first one is this. Now, again, going to compare this to Afghanistan. Now, there was a story about the Canadian PRT just outside of Kandahar. So the Kandahar airfield was outside the city. Inside the city, you had the Canadian PRT. Now, the Canadian PRT was apparently next to a former warlord's compound. And a shell got lobbed over the Canadian PRT and landed in the warlord's compound. Now, the warlord found out who did this and made a summary example of them. And then the Canadian base was never shelled again, apparently, because they were more afraid of the warlord than they were of the Canadian military.
Yeah.
Because the military has rules of engagement, whatever you want to say. And so Was there something like that with the cartels? Like, like you were saying, they control cities and stuff like that. Like,
Yeah,
if they wanted no crime in the city they were in for whatever reason, like, okay, I don't want anyone else, or only have the sanctioned crime that they sanctioned.
yeah.
Like what was the fear like of them compared to the fear of law enforcement?
No, absolutely. That's a very good point, I think. And I think understanding the mechanics of Afghanistan gives, or Eastern, all Eastern Europe or Africa, and this idea of warlords. I mean, in my second book, I call it gangster warlords, and I believe that if you look right across the Americas, from Jamaica to Brazil to Mexico to Central America, there's a certain kind of these gangster warlords. I believe is what they're. So yeah, absolutely. There's in fact they run their own justice systems in many of these places, or they like you see in the favelas in Brazil. I had an interview there with one of the leaders of favela, and he would talk about how he would rule if somebody came to him and said, somebody raped my sister, then he would say, okay, bring me the person, and then we're going to decide what we're going to do. Are we going to kill them? Are we going to exile them, or we're going to mutilate them? Recently, there was a case of a guy accused of rape in a town in Mexico where they had a video of putting dogs on him to eat his genitals. As their punishment for an alleged rape there. So yeah, people are terrified of that, of the gangsters doing that kind of stuff. People are terrified of justice by gangsters, or of them saying something like there was curfews imposed during COVID summers. Some of them saying we're going to impose curfews, and if anyone they answer to us. But then these guys, still the cartel guys, are still going to like run around the streets. Everyone else is on curfew, but we're still moving around. So yeah, totally. Now, if you look at El Salvador right now, under Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, he's reduced violence massively, and it's almost certainly because of a pact, a truce between gangs, of the government being involved in that. The gangs saying we're going to dial down the violence, so we're going to stop the gangs killing each other. We're going to tell people you can't. So we reduce the violence in a big way. And then his public discourse is saying, no, that's not the case. It's my law enforcement, but there's basically very strong evidence that that's the case. So yeah, I mean, it's true. It's also very difficult how should governments deal with extremely violent criminals who have commit murder, who commit extortion, commit kidnapping. In El Salvador, one of the criticisms is, I talked to one market trader there, that in El Salvador, there's massive extortion by the gangs. So, well, they stop the gangs killing, but they're still letting them shake people down. So you're going to give a license to these gangs to shake down all these regular people, and they've got no choice but to still pay the gangs. You're empowering these criminal organizations. Another racket they're involved in across the Americas, but you've seen this in El Salvador, seen this in Jamaica, is pressuring people in their neighborhoods to vote for certain political parties. So you say, okay, and everyone here's got to vote, so that way. In Mexico as well, and sometimes saying, give me your credential, give me your vote, give me your credential, and we'll take it and we'll make the vote for you. You saw that in the most recent election in Mexico as well. So yeah, it is true they have become power, and is a solution then to say, well, we've got to recognize these are political actors in a way. Mm-hmm. We have to recognize that reality, that they're political actors with political power, and with the power of the violence in these areas, and we have to say deal with them. But then how can you and it's not like, and the difference is, whereas before with political actors like, say, in Colombia, you had the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, a guerrilla army, but you say, well, these are people who have a political cause, or so we can deal with them. Because they're ideologues. We can make peace treaties and so forth, but you can really make peace treaties with the Sinaloa cartel or the Jalisco New Generation cartel, and say we're going to give allow. But I don't know. It's I mean, right now there's been, in the last 20 years, in the new millennium, more than 2 million murders in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd say it's the most murderous region in the world. There's been more bodies dropped in Latin America and the Middle East. It's in the Americas, 47 and 50 the most murderous cities. We've got to look into this stuff. It's kind of been hasn't really in some ways received the global attention it deserves in terms of the violence and the implications of that violence. And this is this is the issue of refugees going to the United States, which is at the center of politics in the United States and Trump and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing. I mean, there's a big domino effect. Okay, the last thing I want to talk to you about is the corruption, because you'd mentioned this a couple of times. Now, I'm going to give you a silly example. So, like, my family's from India,
Yeah.
and I've always said, like places like India, the corruption is more honest. And what I meant by that was, okay, my grandfather, his house got robbed. So someone burgled his house. He went to the police, made a complaint, and a couple of weeks later, or a few days later, they called him. They said, "We caught this guy, and we think we found your stuff." So there's a table full of stuff. And I asked my grandfather, "Do you see your things?" And my grandfather pointed out a few of the things that were stolen from his house. And so he's sitting and waiting, and the cops come back after a few minutes, and they go, "Okay, we spoke to the guy. He's admitting to everything else, but he won't admit to your stuff. If you give him a few hundred rupees, he'll." So now these are the cops asking my grandfather for a bribe or whatever, right? Like it's obviously not the criminal, but that's what I mean. Like everyone kind of factors that into the day-to-day business. Like we had that in Afghanistan as well. Like when we needed our passports or you needed something, there was actually a bribe fee that was like, costed in to whenever you had to go get stuff done, because you had inevitably bribe people. So that was like actually factored in. So is that the day-to-day attitudes of people in like Mexico and Latin America? Like, I mean, is it just expecting that there's, okay, if I go to the butcher, I have to make sure he doesn't put his thumb on the scale. I have to make sure, like that kind of stuff. Like, is that just a normal everyday occurrence?
So, with corruption, which is one of the big challenges facing Latin America and facing a lot of regions of the world. And it was described as one very good book from 40 years ago. But yeah, there's this phrase there talking about oil and glue, corruption being the oil and glue. And so the way the machinery of Mexico ticks over is with corruption, like you say. It's like you get someone to do something, a bureaucrat to do something, they won't do it for you, but you give them a bribe and they'll do it for you. So you need a license to open a bar. You've got to pay a bribe to get it, but you pay the bribe, and that's kind of getting someone to do their job. Now, that can work to an extent with some things, but then when you get an entire police force working for a cartel, now also there's a famous phrase, plata o plomo, which is silver or lead. Like this idea of do you want to accept the silver of the bribe or the lead of the bullet? Actually, you see both the pressure of both of those being on, so that people are they're a policeman. You're gonna work with the cartel and draw some money, or you're gonna fight them and be shot dead. What does it mean then when cartels become so powerful? And so it's kind of elements of state capture. Now, I would say it's parts of the Mexican state have been captured by criminal interests and criminal organizations and so forth, and parts of it can kind of function normally. The education system can function normally. The electricity grid can function normally. The health system can function normally, and then you've got like police forces and security interests in that being run and engaged with these criminal cartels. Is that sustainable? That creates a pretty brutal, rotten way. That's not a good way to live. That kind of system, and the kind of it's also there. Yeah, police will want bribes. They'll like say, your relatives, your dad's been murdered. Give us some money, and we'll find out who did it. It's a pretty rotten way for things to be. It's not a good way, and there is efforts, I think, across Latin America to confront corruption, and we're talking about also corruption going up, to presidential levels. You've had a whole bunch of presidents from across Latin America convicted, or accused, or currently with charges that haven't been resolved, or other broader accusations, including high officials in Mexico. I mean, you had the guy who was the former head of public security in Mexico during the administration of Felipe Calderon, currently in the United States on drug trafficking charges. And he was like one of the real architects of the fight against cartels. in prison on trafficking charges. So you've got efforts to try and combat this, and different things from aggressive prosecutors going after. Unfortunately, these efforts haven't resolved these things, and in some ways have sown up a lot of discord in countries, because you'll get a heavy, when you get the system that's so rotten, you've got targets everywhere. So you get a prosecutor, it's like, who do I go after? Oh, I go after my political enemies on corruption charges, but I leave some other people. So you use charges selectively. And when everybody's guilty, but you're only prosecuting certain cases. You have things where suddenly everyone's scared to do business because suddenly they're going after, and then no one wants to invest because if I invest, I'm going to get caught up and get done for corruption. If I try and invest, I'll have to get involved in corruption. So that creates paradoxes. Is it more with foreign, like in Guatemala, you had a lot of foreign pressure to create prosecutors kind of answerable to foreign international organizations, saying we're kind of independent and funded by international organizations, going after national corruption. But then national people are going to kick them out of the country. Do we want to have, people not, losing our national sovereignty, or people, corrupt people saying, we don't want these people breathing down our necks. So extremely difficult. And again, not easy answers. But it's not a good. There's corrupt situations you can live with, and they can be okay. But when it's living with this level of violence, and I mean, Mexico is a beautiful country that has so much. Mexico's got it all. Mexico's got beautiful beaches from Baja California to the Pacific to the Caribbean. It's got jungles, it's got mountains, it's got amazing food, it's got history and pyramids, and it's got amazing people. Mexico's got it all. It's got a beautiful culture. But the real thing that makes this, it's a real tragedy that violence is there, and it makes it very tough. And corruption is part of what's funding and keeping that violence going.
Well, thanks a lot. Well, thank you very much for coming on. It's been really interesting. If you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, where they can get your books, and I'll put the links in the description as well.
Yeah, sure. I've got a weird name. It's spelled, so my name is spelled Ioan. And then my second name, Grillo, Ioan Grillo. But if you type that in, into Google, you can see a bunch of my stuff. You can see my website, ioangrillo.com. Books, you can find them on Amazon, or there's links there to a bunch of indie booksellers. And I have some videos on YouTube where you can see some of my stuff. And all chat and communications appreciated.
Well, again, thank you very much for coming on. It was great talking to you.
Great talking to you.
And thanks everyone for listening. I'll be back.